Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski, and here's a look at what we have coming up on today's show. More oil, a new wall, fewer trade deals, just a typical news week in Washington. We'll take a look at what's happening there. On the home front, Sheriff Clarke is facing some new controversies, and the state is facing a major lawsuit over problems at its juvenile prison. Scott Walker, meanwhile, has a new welfare reform plan. We'll look at what it involves. Then we'll get our winners and losers, and as many viewer questions as we can get in. But let's start in Washington with this segment looking at the first near week under President Donald Trump. We're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington bureau chief. So, Craig, a week ago we were talking about the impending inauguration of Donald Trump. Now we've had about a week, and it hasn't been all that busy with, Keystone XL, NAFTA, the Mexican Wall, Obamacare. There's a lot going on. Tell us what we've learned so far about how the President Trump's administration is going to operate.
Well, this is the Donald Trump that we saw during the campaign, and both in terms of tone and temperament, very aggressive out of the gate. Some of the things he's doing, he can't necessarily do with a stroke of the pen. It's going to take congressional follow-up and congressional action, but he's trying to do as much as he can, as quickly as he can by executive order. There's no sort of tempering of the Trump agenda, the Trump message. We certainly saw that in the inaugural address, which was just, again, a doubling down on his rhetoric from the campaign, not striking a new tone, as presidents sometimes do, not exactly a reach out to the other side, but the Trump that won the election.
Yes, let's circle back and talk a little bit more about that speech last week. So how would you grade that one out in terms of either being an effective message for him or helping him advance some of these causes he's pursuing as president?
Well, I think what he did was it was in terms of tone and message, it was kind of aimed at his voters. It wasn't necessarily aimed at kind of building and growing his coalition. So one of the questions going forward with this president is he going to try to do things to build on his support base and coalition, which you might expect a president to do under these circumstances when he's entering office with kind of historically low ratings compared to other presidents. But he's going to try to do as much as he can, as quickly as he can, with that somewhat fragile base of support that he has. And certainly the Republicans in Congress are deeply invested in making this presidency work, even though we know they are going to clash with him at times on policy, and there are going to be times when they're going to be backtracking on his rhetoric.
Yeah, one of the things we've seen in this first week already is, again, not surprising, but sort of this tendency to get hung up on what would seemingly be small things, like, what's the size of the inaugural crowd? He went back on this notion that there were 3 million or more illegal votes, and he wants to investigate that. Is that a troublesome thing for those Republicans and others who want to just see things, move forward and not get caught up on things like this?
It's not a new thing, but I think it is a troublesome thing now that he's in the White House, that he seems unable to let go of some of his grievances, to let go of things. He's very sensitive about the fact that he lost the popular vote, and he can't let go of this groundless, baseless assertion that millions of illegal immigrants voted. And now he's talking about launching an investigation into an election he won, which is strange. And you saw Paul Ryan whenever he's been asked about the idea that millions of illegal immigrants voted, he has said that he sees no evidence for that claim. It's been debunked. But it's going to be the job of the people around Trump, and I don't know if it's doable or not, but it's going to be their job or their task to try to rein in some of these impulses, which are arguably, borderline self-destructive in the sense that it really kind of muddied his message. It was very distracting. Some people think it's distracting by design, but when you think about the fact that here he is trying to get off to a fast start, there's lots of things he can do with the stroke of a pen to kind of signal that that fast start, and yet a lot of the attention was on his tweets and his asides and on these claims that he's making about crowd size and illegal voting, which are in some cases demonstrably false.
Yeah, and lastly, let's talk a little bit about the congressional retreat that's going on this week. Both sides have their own retreats. President Trump and Vice President Pence are meeting with the Republicans. How important is it that they get on the same page, and what would you say is the biggest impediment to it? I mean, is it the fair trade things, or what areas are they going to have the biggest struggle to get together on?
It is very important, and the potential is there for them to agree on a lot of things and get a lot of things done, and there will be a lot of things that they can agree on and get done, but there are also going to be things they disagree on. I think the Republicans in Congress are going to start out sort of bending over backwards to try to, for Donald Trump to succeed despite their disagreements with him. But there is going to come a time, and there are going to be issues on which they have trouble agreeing with him. Certainly trade, even though it was no surprise, his position on trade is quite a bit different from a lot of Republicans in Congress, including Paul Ryan. I mean, they can they can agree that they don't like maybe the Asian trade pact that was negotiated by the Obama administration because it was the Obama administration, but going forward, they have they are coming from a different place. This is a conservative Republican Congress that is more orthodox in terms of its Republican economic agenda. Trump is in a different place on some big issues. He wants to spend more money on infrastructure than they want to spend. Different place on trade, different place on sort of intervening in the economy to kind of pressure corporations to do certain things. So the great drama, I think, of this year is going to be that relationship between the Republican Congress and this Republican president.
All right. Well, there's plenty more that we'll be able to watch in the many weeks and months ahead. So thanks for joining us today, Craig.
Great.
All right, we're joined now by our panel today. We have Mary Siracusa and Dan Bice in their usual places.
We're back.
The usual faces.
Stuck with us again.
So what's your impressions, guys, of the first week or so here of the Donald Trump era?
A flurry of activity, some of it good, some of it not so good. I mean, obviously he gets caught up, as Craig was saying, in a number of these little minor controversies that you would expect him not to get involved in, but he's also been busy signing executive orders and moving ahead with the wall and some of his other proposals, and he's gotten some good feedback from Wall Street in terms of what the Dow's doing. But yeah, I mean, the main attention has been focused on all of these other minor things that he just can't seem to keep from being distracted about.
Well, why do you think that is, Mary? Just in terms of the nature of things, we don't see as much coverage of the rules on the Keystone XL and the other things that they don't last for days in the news cycle, but we're still talking.
Well, they probably will
about,
over the law.
Legal voters and
right.
That.
I think we'll hear more about the pipelines. I would assume there will be lawsuits and protests, more lawsuits. I think that it's funny because people were criticizing this as like a media sideshow about crowd size at his inauguration. However, he was the one who sent out his new press secretary to do a briefing and launch into a tirade about inauguration crowd size. So I feel like it's one of those things where the sideshow is often generated by the White House in this case.
It also seems like all the people around him want to talk about these things. I mean, there aren't any shortage of Trump advisors who are talking about this very issue, about how he's getting distracted.
Or the CIA speech, which has been
right, and he values loyalty a great deal. But there was a Washington Post story yesterday that says 12 sources said whatever, and I was like, 12 sources? Wow, that's a lot of people talking.
Exactly.
Why is it coming up? I think he brings it up. He's making it an issue, whether he wants to or not. And I think the people around him fear that this is going to cause some sort of impact, so they're talking to the mainstream media about it.
All right, well, let's turn to our next topic, which is Sheriff David Clarke. Now, it's no news that he's in the news, but Dan, why is he in the news this week?
He's jumped in the news in a big way in the past week. He'd been away doing all of these things for Trump, but back home, there's a lot of stuff going on. And the Milwaukee County Executive, Chris Abele, said that he had gotten this complaint over an incident that happened at the airport a week ago Sunday, where this guy, Dan Black, had this minor run-in with the sheriff, and then when he got off the plane, he had 6 deputies and 2 canine dogs meet him at the airport. He filed a harassment complaint against Sheriff Clarke, and Chris Abele now has turned that over to the county auditors to conduct an investigation and find out what exactly happened there. And Clarke has now responded to that, calling it a fake investigation, a political witch hunt. Fake news, and says that he won't allow his people to cooperate with anybody from the county exec's office.
Well, what on just the most basic level, does the county executive have the authority or the auditor to investigate this? If it's,
just to be
behavior
clear,
outside of the office, what can they actually do if it goes forward?
So first of all, it's interesting because Clarke said, "I'm not going to have my people work with anybody at the county exec's office," but actually, the county exec sent it to the comptroller's office, which is a separately elected office, and the auditors there are the ones doing it. What they can do is investigate. They investigate fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think this is, if it's in the abuse category, abuse of resources, abuse of power. And if they believe that's happened, they can turn that over to the ethics board. Ethics board, for instance, could fine him or censure him. They could turn it over if they think something criminal has happened. They could turn it over to the DA's office. But there's no manager that could oversee Sheriff Clarke. The only people who oversee him are the voters. So
it did not sound like Governor Walker was eager to get involved and talk about removing him from office when we asked him.
Right, but there's a representative, David Crowley, who has asked the governor to get involved, which is the one way you can remove him from office besides a recall is to have the governor do it. And you were at the press conference. What did the governor say?
He basically said that he thinks it's up to the voters and that he's an elected official and that the voters should be, or people in his constituents should take the lead in something like that. He did refer to Governor Doyle and Ken Kratz, who Governor Doyle had basically taken steps to remove him from office after receiving a complaint. In that case, it was some pretty seedy things that the DA was involved in.
Well, from the perspective, if it is up to the voters, it's not like Sheriff Clarke just suddenly became controversial and he keeps getting reelected in Democratic Milwaukee County. Has he lost any support of the voters, do you suspect?
For me, it's just anecdotal. I've written about him for 14 years, and generally the response has been 50-50 in terms of people who like him and dislike him, which is very close to what it is in the primaries. He wins with usually 52-53%. These days, it's really rare for me to get supporters of Sheriff Clarke to contact me. I heard last night from a caller, 9 o'clock last night, he called me and was like, "I voted for him 4 times. I won't vote for him again." And, it seems to have escalated. It's not just this investigation. We've had, just this week, he attacked Fox 6 News, and when a reporter talked to him yesterday, he said he wouldn't talk to that person.
If my life depends on it, I think.
Over my dead body, yeah.
Yes.
I wouldn't do it if my life depended on it. He used a racist term to attack a CNN commentator. And this guy...
Cheer up, Snowflake.
Dan Black, he's attacked him and has said that he reserves the right to knock out anybody if he thinks they might assault him, preemptive attacks.
Which doesn't have a lot of support in the legal system.
No, there's not. It might be.
Right,
it might work for foreign policy, but it doesn't for personal relations.
But despite all this, talk a little bit about this move out there, at least for some people, to say what he should be in the U.S. Senate.
Right. What's happened is, even though I, from what I see, that his support locally has gone down, his support nationally has exploded. He's almost got 500,000 people on Twitter who are following him. And people really love what he has to say about cops and the Black Lives Matter and that sort of stuff. So there is this movement to try to draft him to run for the U.S. Senate. He hasn't told me whether he supports this movement or not, but you can go online and type in Sheriff Clarke for Senate. You find an incredibly elaborate website that's been put together with people close to Donald Trump trying to encourage him, raise money. I'm not sure what they're raising money for, but they're raising money to try to...
The thing I've always found interesting on Sheriff Clarke on that point, whenever it says run for mayor, run for somebody, it says, well, if the support's there, if people put the money together, and this sounds like something where people would be trying to put money together and build something for them.
And I've heard there's some Republicans, I talked to a Republican consultant yesterday who said other Republicans thinking about running against Tammy Baldwin now have this as part of their calculus, if they think he will run or not. Someone very close to Clarke told me he was not interested in that, but he's yet to say anything. This site went up January 17th, and in the last couple of days has become, as I said, very elaborate testimonials from, including Donald Trump, a testimony from him. Dog the Bounty Hunter has this elaborate video and letter encouraging Sheriff Clarke to run. So, I mean, the movement's there, but I think there's a disconnect between what's going on nationally and what's going on locally, just like we had with Scott Walker for a while, where he was incredibly popular nationally, and locally he was losing support. And I think there's some similarities, because the support here, I think, fell because there was a sense that he wasn't doing his job. And I think people in Wisconsin have this strong feeling that if we elected you, you should do your job. And from, about...
Didn't do well for Walker when he was campaigning.
Right. And I think from about June on, this sense built and built and built, because the only place you would see Sheriff Clarke was not on the streets on his horse like we used to, but on Fox News.
All right. Well, let's shift gears now to Lincoln Hills, which is another ongoing story here. And we have this update in this segment on what's happening with the lawsuit there. We're joined now by Patrick Marley from our Madison Bureau, and Patrick has been following this story of Lincoln Hills, the state's juvenile prison, for more than the past year. And Patrick, there's some big news this week with a lawsuit being filed against the state on behalf of some of the inmates. Can you describe a little bit about what that lawsuit is alleging, who's filing it, and what, how that's going to proceed?
Sure. The lawsuit is by 4 inmates at Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake. 3 of them are currently there. One of them is at a mental health treatment facility at the moment. It was filed on their behalf by the American Civil Liberties Union of Wisconsin and the Juvenile Justice Center. They're seeking class action status, so they would represent all inmates there now and in the future. And they're seeking to curb the use of solitary confinement and the use of pepper spray. They say that violates their constitutional rights, saying that kids are sometimes put into solitary confinement for months at a time for even minor rule violations.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, you've been writing about this for more than a year. It's just some completely outrageous sorts of things that were going on there. How much at risk do you think the taxpayers are in terms of, these lawsuits, especially if it gets a class action status, could balloon pretty quickly? There's already the need to hire an outside attorney for it, but what's ahead for the taxpayer?
Sure. So the taxpayers are already out $300,000 that was paid to an inmate who, to avoid a lawsuit, the state reached a settlement. This is the boy whose toes had to be amputated or partially amputated after a guard slammed a door on his foot. In this latest action, they don't say so far that they're seeking monetary damages. The state will be hiring outside attorneys. That will come, easily reach into tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how long the litigation goes on. And do not discount the possibility of other lawsuits. I've heard from some attorneys who are contemplating litigation, and they would represent a small number, maybe just one client at a time. But if there's 4 kids who've had their arms or other bones broken that we know of, and those people could be seeking hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars.
All right. So far, the Walker administration has basically been saying we're handling this. We've made a lot of improvements over the last year. What's the mood in the legislature? Is there any sense that they need to step in and require something, make some changes with how that facility operates?
So we really have not heard very much from the lawmakers. They have, the Republican lawmakers who control the legislature anyway, they say that they want to wait out and see what the findings are of this criminal investigation. That's been going on for 2 years, no word yet whether there will be charges and what they will find. The U.S. Department of Justice is also investigating to see if there's been a pattern and practice of civil rights violations. The ACLU lawsuit, if successful, is going to force the state to make significant changes. Those will be big investments that the legislature will then have to consider. It's possible, now that we've reported more and that the ACLU lawsuit has been made, that the legislators will get more involved. They will be considering the budget this spring and summer. But so far, the Republicans in the majority have been very hands-off on this issue.
Yeah, and just to circle back on that lawsuit, sometimes people think of lawsuits strictly in terms of financial awards, but sometimes they also include agreements on how things operate, changes, how do those things tend to play out in a case like this, do you think?
Right, so a good example is the ACLU sued over Techita, which is the women's prison in the state, and they were very successful with that. The state had to make dramatic changes, so they had to hire more nurses. They had, at that prison, like all other prisons, they had guards rather than nurses handing out medicine. They changed that for Techita. That's not the way they do it at the male prisons. And they provided much more psychological care and medical care to the women there. So at Lincoln Hills, what they're looking to do is reduce their amount of use of pepper spray. So that would perhaps mean that they would have to have more staff there, so that when if a kid became belligerent, they had more people available to respond to that in a way that, the ACLU is alleging essentially that when scrutiny came on to the physical response, that Lincoln Hills just resorted to the heavy use of pepper spray. So they'd have to have some other way to deal with that. And then the use of solitary confinement for very extended periods, that again, could require them to have other interventions, more staff, maybe different types of equipment. We haven't seen what those costs might be, but certainly there would be costs associated with those sort of changes in the way they operate.
All right. Well, that's a very good update from you, Patrick. So we appreciate that, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more on this in the weeks ahead as the lawsuit proceeds. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, we're joined now by Jason Stein, also of the Madison Bureau, to talk about Governor Scott Walker's plans on welfare reform. So you and Mary covered that earlier this week. Jason, can you give us a sense of what the governor is planning and how it will fare?
Essentially the governor wants to extend the number of people in Wisconsin who are receiving public benefits like food stamps, the food share program, and who are going through new hurdles like job training or having a job, going through drug testing to obtain those benefits.
All right, and what, the governor sort of harkened back to Tommy Thompson's plan from 20 years ago or so. How is there some real similarities there, or is it just that they're both dealing with welfare itself?
Well, I think there's some similarities and differences. The governor has certainly likened his plan to Thompson's plan, has said that he also, like Thompson, wants to increase the number of people in the workforce. And so in that sense, they are similar. I think Thompson's plan was much bigger and broader than at least anything the governor has proposed so far. There was more, certainly, a larger amount of financial resources that were being repurposed within the government. And also Thompson's program happened in the 1990s, which was, really a time of tremendous prosperity in the country, where it was much easier to get a good paying job than it is today. So, there are similarities and differences.
Yeah, so Mary, you covered that story this week as well. I mean, where's the opposition coming from, and what's its outlook for passage, would you say?
A lot of Democratic lawmakers, and I think there would also be advocates like hunger task force types who say that when it comes to restricting access to food, that becomes of great concern. This would expand it to adults without children, to adults with children, school-age children, so ages 6 to 18. And the governor has said that he wouldn't take away the food benefits from the children. It would only be from the adults, but presumably, like a 6-year-old isn't going to the grocery store to buy themselves food. Their parent would be going to, and so if it's less food for the family, it's less food for the family. So that was a concern among Democrats. Also, there were a lot of details that were not filled in. He said that he'll fill it in when the budget proposal comes out, so it's unclear how much it's going to cost. I think that there are some conservatives who get concerned when you're spending a lot of money, on programs, but also this could potentially be pretty expensive.
All right, well, we're going to shift now to our winners and losers of the past week. And Mary, you're up first with your winner from last week.
I'm the winner. So my winner, I would say, is George Orwell, who is now on the #1 bestseller list. 1984 is. I tried to buy a copy and it was sold out because I couldn't find my old one.
You don't have it from the old literature
I do.
college?
It's just, I think it's in my sister's garage right now. So, but I wanted to reread it. I remember reading, Brave New World, 1984 in school and wanted to reread them and was having trouble finding mine.
You might try Amazon.
Yes. Yeah, I think that actually.
Or just go to the garage. All right,
Dig through the
Jason,
garage.
who's your winner from last week?
Well, my winner over the entire week is inflation. A report out today for the state shows that the State Department of Transportation really underestimated how much new road projects would cost by as much as half, And that turned out to be because even though the spending on these projects could take, 20 years, the department was not figuring in inflation into those costs, which is pretty surprising.
All right, so Dan, we've had two very clever picks. Who's your winner? We're putting the pressure on.
Mine's a straightforward one. It's Jake Lionkugel. He's the latest Wisconsin person to land a job in the Trump administration. He got a White House job on veterans issues. He goes in along with Reince Priebus, Paul Ryan, and I'll probably be writing something later this week on John Hiller and the possibility that he might get a job in the administration as well.
All right, and your loser of the week?
My loser's Robert Miranda, tied in with this whole Sheriff Clarke thing. A number of people have been criticizing Sheriff Clarke, but Robert Miranda, who's this Hispanic community activist, Mary's written about him a lot because he's leading the charge on the lead water pipe issue. Used a racist term not once, not twice, but 3 times in referring to Sheriff Clarke. Certainly crossed the line there.
All right. And Jason, your loser from last week.
Right. So my loser from the past week is actually crowd counts. This is something that, as reporters, we hate covering because it is always a back and forth football that it's like one of those ink blots that depending on whether you're for or against the protesters, you see more or fewer people. And also, I think as the Trump administration is learning, when you're arguing about the size of a crowd or a protest, you're not actually talking about the issues that brought the people there to protest in the first place, which I think doesn't really help the public discourse much.
All right, and finally, Mary, your loser from last week.
I'm going to go with Sean Spicer and Kellyanne Conway. These are, obviously top Trump officials, top spokespeople. Spicer had to go out and berate reporters over the crowd size, insist that this was the hugest crowd that has ever watched an inauguration and the biggest TV, and none of those seem to be true by any objective measure. And I think it raises questions when somebody's telling you something that people have seen with their own eyes. It kind of makes you wonder, how honest will you be with reporters about things that we can't see? And then Kellyanne Conway with her going out and justifying it as alternative facts.
All right, let's try to squeeze in a couple of your questions. So Dan, this one is from LJ. I'll note he or she begins, you guys do a great job, which is a sure way to get your question asked. But the real question is, who is...
She was talking about me.
No.
Who is the one Democrat that Scott Walker doesn't want to face in 2018?
I don't think there's any person right now that he's intimidated by or concerned about. His biggest issue is finding an issue and coming up with a justification for another 4 years of Scott Walker. And I think we started to see a little bit of that with the welfare reform proposal this week.
All right, and Jason, I'm going to throw this question to you. It's from Mark B., who refers to the USA Today article about the Dow Jones reaching 20,000, and he's wondering, in essence, how much of this is rightly attributed to the Obama administration, and how much is due to, say, Donald Trump and the enthusiasm after his election.
Economic expert Jason
Right. My analysis, which I'm completely unqualified to give, is that you really shouldn't attribute too much of any economic condition to a president or a governor. So, my answer would be neither the economy is driven by factors that are, even a president can find difficult to control.
All right, well, we're just about out of time here for today's show. We'll be back next week at the same time and same location, so we hope you'll join us then. Thanks, everybody.